Ukraine was concerned about violations of U.S. law, not Ukrainian law, so there was no investigation by Ukraine to be requested by President Trump. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about President Donald Trump's phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on July 25, and the impeachment push now by Democrats in the House. President Trump was asking Zelensky and Ukraine for assistance in Attorney General William Barr's ongoing investigation into the origins of the Russiagate hoax by the intelligence agencies and the Justice Department that was falsely accusing President Trump and his campaign of being Russian agents, and collaborating with Russia on the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta emails and putting them on WikiLeaks. Paul Manafort was supposed to be kind of the ringleader there. Carter Page, a foreign policy advisor with President Trump's campaign, he was supposed to be a part of it. This led to the Carter Page FISA warrant against the Trump campaign that gave the Justice Department access to Trump phone calls, campaign phone calls, emails, text messages, documents, and so forth. And so they were spying on the Trump campaign by the Obama administration in an election year. But ultimately, it was debunked by none other than Robert Mueller, special counsel. He was appointed in 2017. He completed his work in 2019, and he found that there actually was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia to hack the DNC or John Podesta and put emails onto WikiLeaks. Nobody was prosecuted for that on the American side. There was an indictment of Russians and Russian intelligence officers, but it did not involve actions by the Trump campaign. And so that's what happened to that investigation. So he had a false allegation to begin with. And so President Trump and the Justice Department are now attempting to get to the bottom of how this came into being. U.S. Attorney John Durham is looking into Ukrainian involvement in the 2016 election. On September 25th, Kerry Kupek, a Justice Department spokesperson, issued a statement saying, quote, "A Department of Justice team led by U.S. Attorney John Durham is separately exploring the extent to which a number of countries, including Ukraine, played a role in the counterintelligence investigation directed at the Trump campaign during 2016 election. Quote, while the Attorney General has yet to contact Ukraine in connection with this investigation, certain Ukrainians who are not members of the government have volunteered information to Mr. Durham, which he is evaluating." So I think what this establishes is that there is, in fact, an ongoing investigation by Attorney General Barr into this matter. Now, there are other parts of the conversation, though, with President Trump and Zelensky that the Democrats are focused on, particularly U.S. efforts to counter corruption in Ukraine, which is actually nothing new. This goes across administrations. The Obama administration and the State Department had its own operation in Ukraine to counter corruption. President Trump is focused on this company called Burisma, and the whistleblower complaint, which was filed on August 12th. This anonymous CIA so-called whistleblower, he was alleging that President Trump was conditioning military assistance to Ukraine on, quote, an investigation to, quote, initiate or continue an investigation into the activities of former Vice President Joseph Biden and his son Hunter Biden. And then the other part of it was, quote, to assist in purportedly uncovering the allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election originated in Ukraine. Now, the complaint pointed to a pause in the funding that occurred on July 18th, and this was in the appendix of the so-called whistleblower's complaint. And OMB officials supposedly, quote, stated this explicitly. The instruction to suspend this assistance had come directly from the president, but OMB and NSC officials were still completely unaware of a policy rationale. And what the whistleblower was implying was that the purpose of withholding the funding was to support or to pressure Zelensky into doing an investigation of Joe Biden. But when you look at the transcript of the phone call between President Trump and Zelensky, this was declassified on September 24. Again, it was on July 25th. The Ukrainian president is actually thanking the United States for military assistance. And he says, quote, "It turns out that even though logically the European Union should be our biggest partner, but technically the United States is a much bigger partner." And they were both complaining that the European Union, Germany, France, UK were not doing enough to support Ukraine with military assistance, that the United States was bearing most of the load here. And that appears to be why President Trump paused the funding. He was trying to, I think, leverage much the same way he does with NATO funding, trying to get Europe to pitch in a bit more, therefore to bolster Ukraine. Now, Trump did ask for assistance in Attorney General Barr's ongoing investigation. He said, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. There are a lot of things that went on, the whole situation. I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it, whatever you can do. It's very important that you do if it's possible." And Zelensky said, "No problem." Quote, "Yes, it was very important to me and everything that you just mentioned earlier. I also plan to surround myself with great people. And in addition to that investigation, I guarantee as the president of Ukraine that all the investigations will be done openly and candidly. That I can assure you." And then the topic switched to corruption. And Trump said, "There's a lot of talk," quote, "about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great." Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. Here, Trump is referring to Joe Biden's statement and the Council of Foreign Relations in January of 2018, where Biden was bragging about getting the former Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin fired in Ukraine by conditioning $1.2 billion of loan guarantees. And he said, "If you don't fire the prosecutor, we're going to withhold the funding." Biden said, quote, "I said, you're not getting the billion. I'm going to be leaving here." And I think it was about 6 hours. I looked at them and said, "I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money." Well, son of a bitch, he got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time. Zelensky replied, quote, "I understand and I'm knowledgeable about the situation," referring to Biden, Burisma Holdings, where Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was serving. "Since we have won the absolute majority in our parliament, the next prosecutor general will 100% be my person, my candidate, who will then be approved by the parliament and will start as new prosecutor in September. He or she will look into the situation, specifically to the company you mentioned in this issue. The issue of this investigation is actually making sure that to restore honesty, so we'll take care of that and we'll work on the investigation of the case." So here, Zelensky is confirming that yes, there's an investigation of Burisma. The new prosecutor general will look into that. Note he's not talking about Biden. He's talking about Burisma. What Trump had said was that Biden got the prosecutor general who was looking at Burisma fired, and he was bragging about it, again, to the Council of Foreign Relations in January of 2018. You can check it out and listen for yourself what Biden was saying there. So they're talking about Burisma, but not the Bidens. Those are not the same thing. Make a note. That's important. Now, on April 1st, John Solomon The Hill reported about this issue, but this was before Zelensky was elected. And he reported Nazar Kolodnitsky, an anti-corruption prosecutor in Ukraine, had reopened the office's investigation into Burisma Holdings. Kolodnitsky told Solomon, quote, "We were able to start the case again, but we don't see any result from the case 1 year after reopening because of some external influence." Now, the Solomon report came a few weeks after U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, former U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, was calling for Kolodnitsky to be fired. Now, Lutsenko, who came after Shokin as the prosecutor general, told Solomon that Yovanovitch had given him a do not prosecute list, and this was a major scandal at the time. Yovanovitch has since denied it. She's testified, and Lutsenko's done some public interviews since then. He says that his characterization that you're giving me a list. She was complaining about apparently people who were being prosecuted by the Prosecutor General's office that were supposed anti-corruption activists. And she said, oh, that's going to undermine confidence, according to Lutsenko, in the anti-corruption activists. And Lutsenko said, you're trying to give me a list of people not to prosecute. And that was the allegation. And he kind of doubled down on that. Was there an actual physical list? I think that's where kind of the denial from Yovanovitch comes from. But this is, Lutsenko said this conversation happened. And so, but leaving that aside, Yovanovitch was later removed from her post. This was I think because Ukrainians and President Trump, frankly, had lost confidence in the ambassador. Now, as for Shokin, he told Solomon he was removed in 2016 because of his investigation of Burisma. In fact, he submitted an affidavit in a European court where he said, quote, the circumstances of my dismissal were that I tendered my resignation to the Rada at the request of President Poroshenko. Poroshenko asked me to resign due to pressure from the U.S. presidential administration, in particular from Joe Biden, who was the vice president. He was threatening to withhold $1 billion in subsidies to Ukraine until I was removed from office. After I yielded to the president's request, I submitted my voluntary resignation. Poroshenko commented about it in the media. He said I had carried out a colossal amount of work as general prosecutor, which is something none of my predecessors have been able to do, et cetera, et cetera. The official reason put forward for my dismissal was that I had allegedly failed to secure the public's trust. Poroshenko and other state officials, including representatives of the U.S. presidential administration, had never previously had any complaints about my work. And he added, the truth is I was forced out because I was leading a wide-ranging corruption probe into Burisma Holdings, a natural gas firm active in Ukraine, and Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was a member of the board of directors. On several occasions, President Poroshenko asked me to have a look at the case against Burisma and consider the possibility of winding down the investigative actions in respect of this company, but I refused to close this investigation. Now, Shokin had since applied for a U.S. visa. Rudy Giuliani, the President Trump's lawyer, had been trying to get Shokin into the United States so he could share this information with the Justice Department. And this was denied by the State Department. That's what happened there. The State Department didn't want Shokin coming to the United States. Somebody should probably ask Yovanovitch what she knows about that. According to Solomon, he noted that, quote, Lutsenko said some of the evidence he knows about in the Burisma case may interest U.S. authorities, and he'd like to present that information to the new U.S. Attorney General William Barr, particularly the Vice President's intervention. Lutsenko told Solomon, quote, unfortunately, Mr. Biden had correlated and connected this aid with some of the HR personnel issues and changes in the prosecutor's office. On September 26th, Solomon did a follow-on report, and what it noted was that they were actually concerned in Ukraine about violations of U.S. law, not Ukrainian law. Quote, Ukrainian prosecutors say they have tried to get this information to the U.S. Department of Justice since the summer of 2018, fearing it might be evidence of possible violations of U.S. ethics laws. Lutsenko, and then in a September 29 BBC interview, said that they weren't even looking at the Bidens, that this had predated Hunter Biden's tenure as a on the board of directors. He also said that it was U.S. jurisdiction. He says he told Rudy Giuliani, I told him the same thing I told you, quote, it is not my jurisdiction. It is likely to be the jurisdiction of the U.S. If you will send me a request, yes, I will give you all official information, but it is not Ukrainian jurisdiction. That was my answer. And then as for Burisma, any, quote, possible embezzlement, quote, happened 2 or 3 years before Hunter Biden became a member of the board. So while Biden, who had the prosecutor looking at Burisma fired, while his son was on the board, the conduct under question to do with moving money around predated that tenure, and in any event, might have had been an issue under U.S. law, but not Ukrainian law. So what investigation was Trump supposed to be ordering Ukraine to undertake if Ukraine's telling Rudy Giuliani, telling President Trump, look, this is your laws that might be violated. If you want to start an investigation, you have to file start an investigation and do an official formal request. Lutsenko said, okay, I told Mr. Giuliani, okay, if you start your investigation in the United States, we can officially help you. According to international law, we will give you legal international assistance through requests or question and answer or through a joint investigative team. And this is has to do with the mutual legal assistance treaty between the United States and Ukraine. So if Barr or the Justice Department were to start an official investigation, that's how it would go down. Now, William Taylor, the acting ambassador to Ukraine, testified to the House Intelligence Committee that, quote, on August 16, I exchanged text messages with Ambassador Volker, he's the U.S. ambassador, in which I learned that Mr. Yermak, an aide to Zelensky, had asked the United States to submit an official request for an investigation into Burisma's alleged violations of Ukrainian law, if that's what the United States desired. Taylor added, quote, a formal request to the Ukrainians to conduct an investigation based on violations of their own law struck me as improper, and I recommended to Ambassador Volker that we stay clear. Now, perhaps a formal request would have been basically not typical, but the United States is always pushing Ukraine to take on anti-corruption cases. For example, Yovanovitch, we mentioned her before. She wanted Kolodnitsky fired, quote, to ensure the integrity of anti-corruption institutions. And she was accusing Kolodnitsky himself of corruption. Now, leaving that aside, Taylor's characterization of a request for Ukraine to investigate Burisma, or was it a request to turn over information of potential violations of U.S. ethics law in a U.S.-led investigation? And Lutsenko said in September 26 again that this is a violation of U.S. law potentially, and the United States has to initiate an investigation, and we'll turn over the information. We do have the information. So again, he was offering to give information to Attorney General William Barr. Now, on August 28th, Politico broke the story that President Trump was withholding military aid to Ukraine, and this is how Ukraine became aware of this. Now, according to both Taylor and Tim Morrison's testimony, this is the Ukrainian officials were not aware of any pause in assistance until after this Politico story broke, more than a month after President Trump spoke to Zelensky. So when Trump was speaking to Zelensky about taking on these investigations, and he agreed. He said, I'll look into the Russiagate origins. If there's anything in Ukraine, we'll give it over to you. And we'll take a look at Burisma again. And he had no idea that military assistance was being withheld, and he agreed to do it. So there's no quid pro quo. And by the way, he doesn't mention Biden. Trump mentions Biden as a matter of fact that Biden had this Burisma investigation shut down because this prosecutor got fired. You should probably look at the Burisma case again because it got shut down prematurely, according to Shokin. And Zelensky said, yeah, no problem. I'm familiar with that, and we are looking at it. Now, Tim Morrison, he's a senior director for European affairs at the White House and the National Security Council, and he's since resigned. But he says, quote, my recollection is that Ambassador Sondland's proposal to Mr. Yermak was that it would be sufficient if the Ukrainian prosecutor general, not President Zelensky, would commit to the Burisma investigation. Now, Ambassador Sondland, according to Taylor, told Morrison that, quote, Ambassador Sondland told Mr. Yermak that security assistance money would not come until President Zelensky committed to pursue the Burisma investigation. So Sondland's own communications with Ukraine were apparently to say you need to look at Burisma. That doesn't mean necessarily look at the Bidens. Shokin himself was saying that we have a presumption of innocence until proven guilty in our country. And Lutsenko was saying that the conduct under question, the moving around of money, was years before Hunter Biden was ever on the board of directors there. Now, that doesn't say anything about why Joe Biden or President Obama wanted the prosecutor general fired, but it does give us some information that Ukraine wasn't necessarily looking at the Bidens, and this is what they were telling Trump and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani. So there was information that was going back to the United States, to Trump, where he's aware of the fact that this is not necessarily going to get Joe Biden in trouble per se. It does look horrible, though, if the vice president is getting a prosecutor general fired who's investigating a company that his son works for. And so you should probably look at it again just to ensure that there wasn't any crimes that were missed or something like that. And I think that's reasonable on President Trump's part to bring that to Zelensky's attention, saying, look, you had an investigation, and my country, the United States, the State Department, and Joe Biden, we were interfering in your internal affairs, and we're apologizing for that. So you can get back to work, and we're not gonna be mad at you. Now, Sondland, for his part, in his October 17 testimony to the House Intelligence Committee, he said on September 9, acting charge d'affaires Ambassador William Taylor raised concerns about the possibility that Ukrainians could perceive a linkage between U.S. security assistance and the president's 2020 re-election campaign. Taking the issue seriously, and given the many versions of speculation that had been circulating about the security aid, I called President Trump directly. I asked the president, what do you want from Ukraine? And the president responded, nothing. There is no quid pro quo. The president repeated, no quid pro quo, multiple times. This was a very short call, and I recall the president was in a bad mood. Now, what about the Bidens? Sondland said, quote, I did not understand until much later that Mr. Giuliani's agenda might have included an effort to prompt Ukrainians to investigate Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign. But that he might have. Here's Sondland saying, I don't have any direct knowledge of that, but I learned later, I guess via the whistleblower so-called complaint there, that there was this allegation. But the origin of the allegation that Trump asked Zelensky to look into the Biden specifically, that's the whistleblower saying that. Trump mentions Biden as a matter of fact because Biden had the prosecutor general in Ukraine fired because Shokin says he was looking at Burisma. So Trump says, look at Burisma. And Zelensky says, we're looking at Burisma. And Sondland tells Yermak, related to the security assistance, look at Burisma. Now, since then, on September 11, the United States has released the military assistance to Ukraine. It was $250 million. And so you have four separate issues here. Ukraine seeking to turn over information to the U.S. about possible violations of U.S. ethics laws, which you can see from public statements from Lutsenko and other Ukrainians that predate Zelensky's tenure in office, which did not begin until after he had won the election in late April. Ukraine's own investigations into Burisma, which have been ongoing for years, according to Shokin, the U.S. holding back security assistance, and Trump allegedly asking for an investigation specifically into the Bidens in exchange for security assistance, for which there's actually no evidence. They're not all the same thing here. So let's take it one by one. Can the U.S. demand that Ukraine investigate corruption into Burisma, or to turn over information of possible violations of U.S. law, or to cooperate with Attorney General Barr's investigation into the origins of the Russiagate conspiracy theory? Yes. The United States can do that. President Trump, in the conduct of his Article 2 foreign affairs powers, can relay that information to Ukraine and say, please assist us with these investigations. Again, we have a mutual legal assistance treaty with Ukraine. And so that's perfectly above board there. Can the U.S. pause military assistance to Ukraine? Yes, the president can do that. Office of Management and Budget, they put the pause on. They did a review at the State Department and Defense Departments. They came back clear. They said, yeah, let's do it. And they released the military assistance. Now, Sondland is said to have tied the two things together. So can the Attorney General Barr's Russiagate origins investigation and the Burisma, can that be folded into security assistance cooperation with the United States and saying, help us out with these things and we'll give you the security assistance? I say yes. And specifically to that point, Ukraine is accused of helping U.S. intelligence to gather false information on President Trump and his campaign and disseminating it to the U.S. Justice Department, completely interfering in the U.S. political process and the 2016 elections. Again, Kerry Kupak, Justice Department, on September 25th says that there is an investigation. Ukraine is a part of that investigation, and they are going to coordinate with Ukraine to get the information. Figuring out what role foreign intelligence agencies, including ones allied with the United States, because they were interfering in the 2016 elections, it goes to the legitimate question of whether Ukraine is a reliable ally and can be trusted with military assistance. Does that mean Trump was ordering an investigation of the Bidens? No, because the information Ukraine was providing in the first place was to be of violations of U.S. law, not Ukrainian law. That's the Ukrainians who said that. And that whatever violations occurred were long before Hunter Biden ever served on the board of directors there. And Taylor, Morrison, and Sondland all testified that the ask was to investigate Burisma, not the Bidens. And you can have a legitimate interest in investigating corruption in Ukraine, even if it's a Burisma holdings. Lutsenko said, I don't know of any reason to investigate Joe Biden or Hunter Biden according to Ukrainian law. And he was the prosecutor general. So he knows what he's talking about here. And this was the information they conveyed to Trump. So Trump knew what the information was, or he should have. Giuliani certainly received this information. Now, meaning neither the alleged whistleblower, who is a public official and figure who once worked at the White House, and he's not some secret agent. He could be called to testify. To call him to testify, nor any of the diplomats. They've all come to testify already. They didn't have firsthand knowledge of an allegation to do with interference in the 2020 elections in Ukraine to initiate an investigation of Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden, because the Ukrainians were not accusing the Bidens of breaking Ukrainian law. So there was no investigation for Trump to order the Ukrainians to pursue against the Bidens. Now, there may be something to Biden's admitted firing of Shogun, who said he was investigating Burisma in March 2016, coming after Hunter Biden had been hired in April of 2014. And that might come up in a potential investigation of Burisma. It might come up in Barr's investigation of foreign interference, Ukrainian interference in the 2016 elections. But that potential that the Bidens might be implicated or just mentioned or are part of an investigation, or they might be subject to questioning, does not delegitimize looking at the company, Burisma, and nor does it decouple U.S. interest in going after corruption in Ukraine. If anything, Americans' involvement in foreign corruption is a matter for the Justice Department to consider. Under U.S. law, you have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we have an absolute interest in the United States, Barr does, and the Justice Department, to make certain that U.S. government officials are not abusing their power in foreign countries. We don't know if that's what happened here, and that's what Barr, I think, would want to look at if there was an allegation of wrongdoing. And I'll leave you at the close here. Either way, it is in U.S. interest that corruption in Ukraine be rooted out, that foreign intelligence interference into U.S. elections be deterred, and ultimately, President Trump has an Article 2, Section 3 constitutional responsibility to enforce U.S. laws, to make certain that the laws be faithfully executed. Even if those accused of breaking laws are politically motivated or connected natural gas firms or the former vice president. As the Democrats have liked to point out throughout this entire process, no one is above the law. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.